favorite part coming up right now.
Hello friends, welcome to another episode of Brough Guitars Review. Today, we're going to be talking about quite a bit of things, to be honest. We're going to talk about everything Gibson. We're going to talk about a little bit of the history. We're going to talk about, a deep dive into this guitar, how I came about it, and some controversial topics as well. But before we get into everything in today's episode, I'd like to thank each and every single one of my subscribers up to this point. Anyone who's felt the need to share or just, spread the word of Brough Guitars. It means so much to me, especially when you guys reach out, your comments. Like I said, I've really enjoyed the conversations and friendships that we've made along the way, and I hope to continue to do that. So please subscribe, please. There's over 90% of you all that aren't subscribed, and I'd like to be able to do this more often, in all honesty.
Are you not entertained?
So let's try and make that happen. And, I don't look at you guys as subscribers, from one bald man of wise words to another.
I don't have friends. I got family.
All right, so good old Gibson guitars. Now, Gibson is a company that's been around since 1902. They've been around for over 120 years.
Wow!
120 friggin' years. So clearly they're doing something right. Now, Gibson isn't necessarily been always perfect, just like anything else in life. They've had their ups and downs, no different than you would in a relationship, a job, day to day, getting aspirin. All kinds of stuff can happen, right? Good and bad.
I don't know. I'm making this up as I go.
But Gibson overall as a whole, there's just something about the company. Now, I'm not endorsed by Gibson by any means necessarily. They don't even know that I exist. Gibson for me personally has always been a very intimidating brand, especially when you're very first starting out playing guitar, because usually real Gibsons, whether that be an SG, a 335, a Hummingbird, a Les Paul, are usually so far high up on the racks in a music store because they come with a really hefty price tag, that it's very intimidating.
It's impossible. It's not, we cannot afford it. It's impossible.
I remember, being so terrified to touch one. Gibson was never really on my radar because it was just an intimidating brand.
This is Sparta!
I thought if you had, a Gibson, that was real deal. You knew what you were doing. You were a guitar player aficionado. To me, it was like the epitome of guitar before I really got into, obviously other brands and this and that. But just upon first impressions, I knew what a Les Paul was without really knowing what a Les Paul was. So, again, nothing to be intimidated by. We're going to definitely go into the deep dive as far as this guitar and everything. Gibson is, in a synopsis, I guess you could say. Now, obviously, with Gibson being around for over 120 years, they've had a lot of opportunity to really make a lot of impressions on a lot of guitarists. And for me, the thing with Gibson that I always found fascinating and intimidating was just more so the legacy of Gibson, just because they had a lot of influence on a lot of different music genres. They're known for the birth of rock and roll, and so as well as Fender, been around for forever. It's really been Fender Gibson throughout the years as far as innovation and this and that. Because Gibson's been around for 120 years, they were the birth of rock and roll and blues and country. I've seen them used in worship music, and they have a slew full of instruments that have their own unique sound. But again, Gibson has a gigantic legacy, a lot of history as far as, the times that they were originated in, to all the things that we've experienced in the last 120 years as the human race. They've been around for all of it. And with that legacy and that history, there also comes, a lot of, pedigree. There comes a lot of prestige with the company, despite some faults of recent years.
You cannot escape the truth.
Again, there's just something about Gibson in general. And like I said, for me growing up, it was just such an intimidating brand. I was never able to really afford one, therefore I never really looked into it. There's out of the many guitarists that you can choose from when it comes to Gibson, I'm curious to see who comes to mind for you all specifically, especially with a Gibson Les Paul. Now, for me, and feel free to go down in the comments and please let me know who comes to mind first, or who was your influence, or the first time you saw a Les Paul. But for me, there are a bunch of players that I can think of off the top of my head that have played a Gibson Les Paul. You know, Jimmy Page, Joe Walsh, Zakk Wylde, Neil Schon, Eddie Van Halen at one time played a Les Paul, Eric Clapton, Joe Bonamassa, Billy Gibbons, Slash, Randy Rhoads. Just, I mean, a bunch of guitarists that you can choose from. Some continue to stick with the Gibson brand, and that was just their main guitar that they played throughout the rest of their career. There's a lot of people, you know, within the music industry that have a bunch of Gibsons, a bunch of Les Pauls that they have held on to. But, you know, for me, you know, I remember somebody who had a huge influence on me originally, believe it or not, as many of the Eddie Van Halen guitars you see was not Eddie Van Halen. One of my biggest influences at that time, for me, my number one guitar god that really got me, like, even thinking about guitar was actually Joe Perry from Aerosmith. Now, Joe Perry, I'd seen him play Les Pauls, you know, off and on, as well as, you know, other instruments as well, but he was the first person that I saw that actually had a Gibson Les Paul, and it was just, I thought that it was just such a sexy looking guitar, and I like the shape, the different colors and variations that they had. I just thought, man, that is a man's guitar right there. Obviously, as I started to progress in my knowledge of guitar and experiencing more guitars out there, this and that, the person that really originally made me just want to go out and now officially try to go buy a Les Paul or Les Paul looking guitar was Slash. Now, Slash, you know, his original, you know, Appetite for Destruction guitar is actually a knockoff, you know, 59 Les Paul replica is what it was.
Hell to the no, no. Hell no.
Of course I knew. I just had no idea.
And then later he signed with Gibson and they made all of his reissues and replicas and this and that, but stories for other times. He was always famous for having kind of like a sunburst looking kind of Les Paul. Now, I went a long time, and I still don't really like a whole lot of sunbursts, and we'll touch on this here in a little bit, but I actually got, I think it was, if I could find a photo around here somewhere, was an Eagle S101 guitar. It was a Les Paul shaped, you know, kind of guitar on the cheaper end, but I actually remember I went to the Bahamas. I was betting 10 cents on a slot machine, and it went at about almost $900. And I was 16 at the time, and you have to be 18 to gamble legally in international waters. So I actually had my mom cash the voucher, gave me the money, and then I bought a lot of those fab or fob guitar pedals. I got myself a Behringer amp, and then I bought the kind of Les Paul kind of copyish that Eagle S101 guitar, and it was a sunburst guitar. And I thought, you know, I was just, you know, the bee's knees there. I thought I was going to play like Slash. I didn't even know what distortion was at this point in time. I barely even knew, you know, holding down different strings would create different notes. I had no idea what I was doing.
Bruh.
I was definitely in the realm of being naive and thinking that gear was going to make me sound a certain way. And as we've all come across in life, the sound,
A lot of it's in your fingers.
the only thing that really gets in the minutia details of sound is then the gear, if you really want to nerd out and this and that. But the gear is not going to make you play any certain way or this or that. It definitely inspires you and this and that, but, you know, stories for other times. But you get my point. Now, it's pretty much since I got my hands on that Eagle S101, I held on that guitar for a lot of years. I still have it, but it's in pieces and parts now. I've never done anything with it ever since.
You're a monster!
You know, like I said, I always noticed that Gibson Les Pauls specifically were just always super expensive. And then, you know, I played some Epiphones along the way, never owned one. I was never, you know, fortunate enough to be able to own anything Gibson. So therefore, I just kind of gravitated more towards Fender, and then obviously EVH stuff and, you know, other guitars, Gretsch, you know, so on. All kinds of different wonderful brands out there. But like I said, Gibson just always seemed like I never wanted one unless it felt enticing enough and right for me to justify spending that kind of money on a guitar. There was a lot of thought that went into it, but like I said, it was just always just out of the realm of possibility in my mind that it never really truly became a want for me. So therefore, I never really gravitated towards, you know, guitars that looked like a Les Paul or this or that. I was definitely more Super Strats, Telecasters, guitars of that nature. Really spoke to me for a lot of years. You know, later in life, you know, came across this guitar, which we will touch on that story here in a bit. But first, I want to give you just a little synopsis, Gibson, and a little history. Now, before we deep dive into this guitar, what it is, some of the controversies regarding it, and Gibson in general, we're going to have to go back to the beginning when rainbows were still in black and white. So, Gibson was founded in 1902 in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Obviously, years later, they would individually move in their whole headquarters to Tennessee, whether it be Memphis, Nashville, this or that, as Gibson began to grow. But Gibson was primarily making acoustic guitars, you know, for the bulk of those early years. And, you know, in the 1900s and especially in the 1950s, times were just different. You know, it was all about innovation and entrepreneurship, thinking about the bigger idea, being outside the box. You know, it was just, I can only imagine that it was such a great time to be alive. And, you know, I'm an old soul at heart, and I think I would have really thrived in the 1950s. But again, times were, you know, a lot different back then. So in the 1950s, just to put things in perspective as far as a little bit of history goes, gas was only 27 cents a gallon back then. So with inflation and everything in 2025, if you were to equate that, it was about $3.38 a gallon in today's society. And then again, that was back in the 1950s for most of that decade. So in the 1950s, there were two people that really get credit for the very first solid body guitars, which was either Leo Fender or Les Paul. We'll let chat duke it out as far as who they really think were the first ones to kind of come across that. Because basically Leo Fender was already had the Fender Telecaster, also at that time known as the Nocaster, but Leo Fender at that time, again to my understanding, already had the Nocaster or Telecaster out, and Gibson wanted to kind of get in on that.
It's over, Anakin! I have the high ground!
And rival that in this new market and this new innovation and this new idea. So Les Paul had already approached Gibson at one point with his very own solid body guitar that looked pretty much like this. So he comes to them and says, hey, I got this idea, there's a solid body, blah, 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 blah. Gibson kind of turned him down and...
No, 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 hell no!
Didn't really think anything of it, and it wasn't until 1951 when they had sought out Les Paul yet again, and then had him repitch that idea, and then all of a sudden wanted to, you know, partake on that.
Yes! That's awesome!
Now, Les Paul wasn't just any average Joe. You know, he actually had his own TV show, and at one point in time was like considered like the largest star in the United States with his wife. He actually had his own TV show. So he was already kind of a big deal. But then what really helped Gibson out is once they, you know, came to an agreement contractual agreement with Les to where they're like, hey, we'll basically, we want to make, your solid body guitar, but we want you to only play Gibson. And so they came to an agreement. So there's a little bit of controversy as far as like who really came up with the body design. McCarty says that he did it. Les Paul says that he did it. Don't know, wasn't there, don't have a dog in that fight. Just thankful that somebody came up with the idea because it's a sexy looking guitar. But in 1952, then Gibson finally unveiled the Gibson Les Paul, and I want to say it was the standard. I don't know if they had the custom just yet. They did unveil the Gibson Les Paul. It was a gold top, and it was at NAMM, which, if you don't know, NAMM is basically the largest, musical convention in the world, where all of these different brands come and they bring their new products out for that year, and then all of the musical companies will basically put in the bids or contracts or this or that to be able to carry said products of that. So that's pretty much what NAMM is to this very day. Never got to go, so if anybody ever wants to take me, I'm down. Let me know. I'm in Vegas. I ain't far. Okay? I'll meet you there. Promise. But no, 1952, the Gibson Les Paul debuts. Now, the Gibson Les Paul Custom, which was pretty much, the top of the line, to put things in perspective, was $375 in the 1950s. So basically what that would equate to in 2025's time is about $5,000. So as you can tell from even the early on 1950s when the Les Paul very first debuted, it was not a cheap guitar by any means. So when you're sitting there looking at these guitar price points today, all things considered, it's really not all that different. So the Gibson Les Paul was pretty much a gold top, and it stayed the same, all the way up through about, 1957. And from 53 to 57, sales were down on the Les Paul.
And his name is John C.
No one was really wanting it. And again, you got to look back at the time, again, $5,000 essentially for guitar, very expensive. And then also, too, new, innovative, people were still about their acoustics. It was just, sales were down. Gibson was struggling when it came to just specifically the Les Paul. So they decided they want to do something a little bit different. In order to try to entice the sales and make things a little bit different, this is where you now get into what people consider the highest value guitars outside of someone famous playing a guitar, the most sought out guitars that there are, which are also known as the bursts. So the burst really came to be in 1958. Now, the 1958 Gibson Les Paul and the 57, spec-wise, were the exact same except for the color. So they very first came out with the 58, which was known as the Cherry Burst Les Paul, which this is not a Cherry Burst. But over 58, they did kind of come out with different colored bursts over time. And the different variation of the burst was really due to the dyes and the fact that they were using nitrocellulose lacquer on their guitars. That was, due to sun exposure, playing, sweat, skin, friction, all these different factors, weather even, moisture in the air, all these different variables were causing the guitar to actually physically make some changes when it came to the dye. And then they also started to use darker bursts, such as this one, to actually cover up imperfections. So maybe there's an imperfection here on the outside or this or that. And then that's why they started to really incorporate the sunburst look. So when you start to see mid to late 50s guitars with this darker burst, was actually to cover imperfections. And also, to my understanding, in 1957, the seam on the Les Paul was actually more so off center, or it was a multiple piece body guitar, where actually the 1958 Gibson Les Paul is where they finally just made a complete center seam. So that would be something to look for if you were actually looking for an old school Gibson. If for a 58, 59, something along those lines, you want the seam to be completely in the center. That could be a giveaway that maybe it's a fake if it's not. Just something to keep in mind. So another thing that makes the bursts very desirable was, again, you got to remember the times. They weren't exactly using just, top line craftsmen or machines necessarily to make everything, and that's another thing that makes Gibson such a sought out brand, or something that somebody wants. It's highly coveted because, again, it's American made. It was a different time. People took a lot of pride in making things with their hands. My grandfather would always tell me, the best things in life are made with your own hands. And so that was, again, the kind of the pedigree and the mystique of, Gibson as a whole, was because it was American made. They took a lot of pride. And, they had like housewives and just random people just in these shops with it's not like luthiers today, they just did what they did. And that's why bursts are so sought after, is because each of them have their own characterization. They're very different because no two guitars were really alike in that time. Maybe they were spec'd the same, but these people were hand winding the coils themselves, or they were using the machines to coil them, but they weren't looking at how many winds they were doing, or thinking of how much color to apply, or this carve here being exact same as that, or whatever else. It was just different times, and that's why they're so sought after, because there are Les Pauls even to this day that sound great over other ones. You might get a bad one, you might get a piece of crap, or you might get the greatest thing you've ever heard. But again, that's any guitar, because at the end of the day it's just wood, paint, and electronics, and it's going to sound how it's going to sound. But there's still differences in each guitars. But especially back then, some were more resonant, some had less whine, some had more or overwound, so they sounded more percussive or more dynamic. Or maybe there was a shortened electronics because it wasn't hooked up correctly. They didn't really have, the quality control that we would have today. All these different variables is what makes a burst sought after. Now, again, Gibson during that time tried to be different to try to entice sales, so they came out with the bursts. But then if you look in the later 50s years, 58, 59, especially towards the end of 58, is when they started to use their leftover woods from their jazz instruments. So their jazz instruments were really like the bee's knees of Gibson. That's the thing that was really pushing the sales outside their acoustics. And they were using very high-figured woods. Anything from quilted maple to flame maple. If it was pretty, it was going on those. And then whatever they had left over, they started to put on the later years in the 50s on their Les Pauls. Now, it didn't really become industry standard on the Les Paul until 1959. But this is my 1958 reissue Murphy Lab Les Paul, which we will touch on again later. But as you can see, this one has quite a bit of flame in it. Very pretty guitar. But again, not really known for the 58. The 58 was more of a plain top traditionally. But again, if they had any leftover woods, towards the end of 1958, they did start to incorporate some of their flamier wood on their guitars. But in 59, that's really where it was just industry standard. It was getting pretty woods on those guitars. And the neck also was starting to get a little bit thinner on the 59. And the 58 traditionally is a much thicker neck, which is either for some people or not for some people. Again, touch on that again later too. It was just a different preference. And so the 59, as most people know it to be, as the holy grail of guitars, is the most sought after one. People are paying, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars for those guitars. And if it's owned by anyone famous like Joe Perry, Slash, Billy Gibbons, Joe Bonamassa, anybody, those guitars are going for millions of dollars.
A wet raccoon doesn't have $7 billion in the bank.
So it's just crazy. All right, so now we're gonna deep dive into this guitar, how Matt came about it, and the specs, and this and that. So let's go ahead and dive in here, because the coolest guitars are in fact the one with a story. All right, so the date was almost this time a year ago. It was May 28th, 2024. And the only reason why I know that is because I looked at the receipt. Keep receipts. But I wanted to just document everything because, again, you know, I was not expecting to get this guitar at all. I went to Guitar Center. There's two out here in Vegas. I went to the one out here up toward North Las Vegas. And I went to go actually buy my PV amp. It was actually used. And because, you know, laws and this and that and people stealing stuff and this and that with trade-ins, they had to hold on to it for, you know, a certain amount of days like you would a pawn shop to make sure that no one claims it as stolen. So I got it for a really, really good price. And I was actually going in there to see if they had the PV Mini, and they did. But as I walked in, I had my daughter with me, and, you know, they obviously have all these guitars just hanging up on the walls. And as I started to just kind of glance around and this and that, I saw this Gibson Les Paul just hanging on the wall, just sitting there, and it just was like calling out to me, saying, "Kyle, buy me, sweet, precious, rosy cheek baby, Jesus." For the love of God, buy me!
Top Gun actor.
And I have never been so enticed to buy a guitar in my life. And like I said, I never thought in a million years I would get a Gibson Les Paul. But see, I had started a new job, came across, you know, a decent amount of promotion as far as money, and, you know, like, I didn't go in there thinking I was going to drop money on a Gibson Les Paul. Now, it was so high up on the rack that I couldn't tell what it was, what year it was, anything about it. The only thing I could see from a distance is it did have a couple of, you know, nicks and pings and this and that, which I thought was kind of odd. And so, you know, I happened to go up to the associate and I said, "Hey man," I said, "I want that guitar." Just on a whim. Didn't even know a price, nothing. And I figured, you know, once they finally got down, I'd take a look at the tag, maybe have a mini stroke, heart attack, maybe go to Jesus in that moment, whatever. Something bad was going to happen, because I just figured it was probably a priced guitar, but it was over on, like, the used racks up in the rafters. But because it was high, that probably told me it was expensive, because the most expensive guitars, they don't want you stealing knobs off that, switches, or anything touching it. They get it down, and I just take a look at it and automatically just fell in love with it immediately. Didn't play it, didn't even strum a chord, nothing. I didn't do, you know, crap with it. I grabbed it and I was like, well, it's not too heavy. Yeah, how much is this? You know, and like I said, I want to be open and honest, you know, with you all. But what this is a 1958 Murphy Lab Gibson Custom Les Paul. That's what it is. Now, I had known about Murphy Lab, you know, just through the grapevine, watching YouTube videos. I never thought I was going to get a Murphy Lab Les Paul. It always appealed to me, but they always just seemed so expensive.
Some 100-odd years ago, a motley collection of tough mustaches galloped across the West and left behind a raft of legends and leisure domains.
But again, I do want to be honest with you guys, like I said, about prices and yada, 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 which we'll take a deeper dive again later. It's just, I want to tell you guys in a certain order of this stuff, because it's just crazy to me that I'm fortunate enough to even get to hold one of these, because I never thought I would ever have one. And so when we go to check out for the guitar, they said, you know, it's actually on sale. So I'm thinking maybe it probably doesn't come with a case or case candy or whatever else, because again, it was turned in used. And, you know, they told me that I think originally the price was like $6,000. And I was like, $6,000. And they're like, but it's actually on sale. And I was like, what? They're like, yeah. I was like, so how much does it come out to? They're like, oh, it's about $4,600. And then with taxes and this and that, it actually ended up being about $5,000. And again, we will touch base on whether we think that this guitar is worth $5,000 or not, or in general, for the controversial topic later. But, you know, I said basically take my money, I put it on a rewards card just to be able to get that cash back. And then I was fortunate enough to have the money to just go ahead and pay it off, you know, on my credit card immediately. Be careful about credit card debt, guys. Don't get in it. It sucks. But if you got the money for it, put it in your rewards card, you know what I mean? Get the money back for it. Well, let's think. I got the guitar, and it came with the original case. It had all the case candy, and I started going down the rabbit hole as far as the backstory on this guitar, when it was made. You know, I wanted to know every little detail about it that I could. And this guitar was actually made in March 24th of 2022 is when this guitar was actually made. Alright guys, so as you can see here, we got a Gibson case from the 1950s, the brown traditional famous case. And then right here you have the Gibson logo. And here she is, the 1958 Gibson Murphy Lab Custom Les Paul. Look at that pink lining there in the case. Always love that look. Now the 58, like most Les Pauls, is going to traditionally be a Brazilian rosewood fretboard with the plastic proloid inlays, finished in nitrocellulose lacquer. This is the bourbon burst. It's going to be a mahogany body with a flame maple cap, meaning traditionally, like most Les Pauls, that separates it from a lot of its competitors, it's actually going to be a thicker cap. It's not going to be a veneer on this. And as you can see here, it's got the flame maple top. It just really very flamey. So you're going to tell me they were definitely shooting for the later 1950s in this. It has that old school, the clear plastic knobs there that are actually all the way see-through gold. They're not actually painted gold throughout. It's kind of like a illuminating effect. It's got the plastic pickguard on there, which I've actually often just debated taking off, but historically I like it a lot. You can see the checking here with the nicks and pings. Again, here's those proloid inlays. And it's got the plastic tuners there on the side, which I've always been a fan of. I never liked the all metal tuner look. Onto the back of the neck and the body, as you can see, there's quite a bit of checking. There's some buckle rash where they were going for there along the side. Again, more of that pink lining. Gosh, that case looks sexy. Around the control cavity there, again, look at the checking that's going on in there. Some more nicks and pings, this and that, trying to get the lighting right so you can really see. There's a nice gash there in the back of the neck. Traditionally, the Les Paul is going to be a D-shaped back of the neck. Here's the back again, but again, I was never a big fan of the thicker D-shaped neck. It's more like a baseball bat, I always thought, until my hands got bigger, and now I've actually loved that style neck. Now we're going to deep dive into the case candy. It comes with this little Murphy Lab Gibson booklet here. It's going to have a certificate of authenticity inside, as you can see. It's going to have the serial number as well. We're going to block that out so people can't copy it. And this is the ultra light age, which we will touch on here in a minute. But it gives you kind of the the idea on the wear and talks about it, so feel free to give that a little bit of a read there. And then I always like the outside of the booklet, how it's got the checking, and then where the lab, it actually has a little test tube flask. I always thought that was a cool little touch as well. Another certificate of authenticity here. Nothing on the back. And here's a little letter to the dealer talking about keeping it away from windows and this and that, because the die will change as this instrument's made to change over time and age more, which we'll touch on after you get done seeing this. Here's another just talking about the chemical makeup of the guitar, what would help it age more, this or lack thereof, and then just a little touch on the Murphy Lab and just in general, talking about how they distress it and how you don't want it to distress more rapidly, what to do to store it. This one just talks about just basically the setup, kind of what they were trying to achieve as far as like a low action. Again, nothing on the back of this one either. And then it's going to end up coming with this little cavity cover for where the switch is. It just says, Gibson Les Paul Custom. Pretty heavy duty. Some other specs that I failed to mention that little bit that you just listened to were the pickups. They are custom buckers. They're Alnico 3 magnets, basically designed to be like, super percussive and very dynamic. It does have the ABR, the adjustable bridge, made famous back in technology-wise as far as the 1950s. And so it does have this plastic guard on here still, which is the same plastics that they used back in the 1950s, which is again another thing you happen to get at this price point. I believe it does have the Bumblebee capacitors in here, all four. I've never taken the control cavity off to take a look, but again, that should have been pretty standard back in the 1950s. Three-way toggle switch. It does have the poker chip on there where it says rhythm and treble, just like, again, your traditional Les Paul. It's got, just your normal strap buttons. There's your input jack at the Clusen plastic tuners. And the cool thing about the 1950s is they were actually stamped on with ink, and the first digit actually tells you what year that it was, so the A being 1958, along with the rest of the serial numbers, which is followed by 4 more digits. But again, the reason for the space is to let you know, and it has inked on and then covered in lacquer. So, for the 9, it'd be 59, for the 0, 1960, so on. Now, I remember one time I played a Gibson Les Paul. It was the Zakk Wylde one, and I remember that neck on that thing was the thickest neck I've ever touched in my life when it comes to guitar neck. It was literally like holding a baseball bat, no joke, and I could not get my hands wrapped around that sucker. And I had always heard that the 1958 in particular was one of the more thicker necks, like the 57, because they're identical guitars for the cassette, except this burst. And this D-shaped neck is actually very comfortable. It's not too big for my hands, at all. It's very comfortable feeling. I was actually very shocked by that. But again, two guitars, were alike back in those days. You might get a thicker neck, you might get a thinner neck. So just something to keep in mind if you are trying to buy A, vintage instrument, B, one of these reissue guitars. So now you heard me say that this is a Murphy Lab Gibson custom Les Paul. So Murphy Lab pretty much started back in 2020. Now Tom Murphy was an artisan who'd worked for Gibson back in the 80s and the 90s, and he had really worked on like replicating quote-unquote wear or aging guitars. Basically, the whole premise of Murphy Lab is trying to essentially give you a guitar that would have been made the exact same way back in those days, back in those, quote-unquote glory years, and giving you a new guitar, essentially, but aged to then make it feel like the real deal, or they have the patina of the real deal, or something like that. Because again, we're talking about price points that are just astronomical for, millionaires or people who've hit the lottery or no God himself, basically. That's the way that most of those people are able to come across, like something along those lines of, again, we're talking actual original instruments from the 1950s, 60s, so on. So Tom Murphy started Murphy Lab, which where now he has other people working underneath him that now, age the guitars. And the whole premise, again, of Murphy Lab, I think the real big selling point would be the finish, because again, it is a nitrocellulose finish on these guitars, which is, going to allow the wood to breathe, to age, to take on kind of its own personality. If this was just covered in polyurethane, I mean, you could basically drop it, drag it across the driveway, this and that. The thing's never gonna scratch because it's just covered with so much poly and plastic. That's kind of one of the many controversies of, guitars, is if you allow the wood to breathe, does it sound better, this or that, lack thereof. Now we're going to touch on the controversy known as relicking. Now I know that's a big hot topic. It's been a hot topic for a lot of people. For me, not so much. I've always dug the look of relic guitars. I own guitars that are relic, that I've relic myself, either had relic. I personally have always enjoyed the vibe and the look of relic guitars. And obviously there is an art to relicking, because you can almost make it look too on purpose, too faked, and it just doesn't have the same delivery. Relicking is a huge topic. There's, they always give that reference of ripped blue jeans. Why would you pay money to have holes in your clothes or make it look old and distressed? Why wouldn't you want a new pair of jeans? Or why wouldn't you take the pride in scuffing up the jeans yourself, doing just normal everyday tasks? Or why would it be more expensive, like a thong, where it's like, why is that super expensive when there's nothing to it, as opposed to just normal panties? I mean, I'm sorry for the analogies here, guys, but that's just the first thing that's coming to mind here. There's not much to a thong, so why is it more expensive? The same concept, goes on for relicking and aging a guitar. Some people take more pride in, getting this all messed up itself, or on their own through gigging and playing and their own blood, sweat, and tears. Got a couple guitars myself that I have played the hell out of, and they have started to take on some nicks and pings and this and that. And it does kind of make it cool, because you can, kind of, be like, oh, I remember this exact scratch and where it happened and blah, 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 and yada, yada. Or I was on this vacation, I dropped my guitar, or my girlfriend threw it at me, or my wife, or my dog knocked it over, the cat, whatever. They all got their own stories and their own personality, right? And so you get into this realm of controversy where people just don't understand paying the price point for these relic guitars, because they are very expensive when you're getting them from custom shops.
Could I trouble you for a glass of warm milk? It helps put me to sleep.
You could trouble me for a warm glass of shut the hell up.
But I think specifically with Murphy Lab, they're trying to me personally, I think they're trying to get you at the price point of something as close to an actual guitar that came from the 1950s without actually coming from the 1950s. And I think the big selling point for them is really the lacquer that they use, and whatever concoction they come up with their nitrocellulose to be able to age at a faster rate, and to give it, a patina, have the instrument age with you over time. Now, that's going to be a thing for some people that they're not going to like, and for others that they are going to like. Because again, I bought this used, mind you, right? So this was the ultra light age, and then they have light aged, and they have like a medium aged one and like an ultra heavy aged. I can't remember the actual tiers. Something along those lines, right?
Oh, durka.
But, you know, with the aging process, there's going to be options where you could essentially buy the guitar with just the nitrocellulose lacquer finish, and that's going to cause it to age, and maybe you can then from that point put in your own nicks, dings, and pings playing it over time. Or there's going to be, you know, the where it just looks like it was beat to hell and toured for forever. There are pros and cons to having any of those options, and Gibson Les Pauls are so expensive. That's why I think it's just funny that my very first Les Paul that I've ever owned in my life, as far as Gibson is concerned, was this Murphy Lab, you know, custom shop guitar. Like I said, I'm not going there planning to buy this at all, but I just love the look of Relic guitars. I've always seen, you know, Murphy Labs being super expensive, but, you know, I guess some of the perks are, is, you know, if you were to drop this or get a scratch on it or this or that, it's already kind of dinged up, and it's supposed to age over time, so it's supposed to chip and get scratches easier and this and that, because based on the finish. So when you're dropping that kind of money on a guitar, some people like, you know, really pristine looking guitars, and they want them to stay that way. You know, like a PRS or something like that. PRS, I think, refuses to go down the realm of relicking and that whole genre, but, you know, Fender and Gibson are very much open to that, you know, as well as ESP. Other companies they're all doing it. Again, Gibson specifically, to be able to get your hands on a piece of history without it being a piece of history technically was another thing for me. It was people buy into it for the pedigree, for the name, for the legacy. It's, you know, some people will buy it because they think it's like part of the cool kids club because, hey, I own a Gibson Les Paul. And not to sit there and see that none of that's not true or good or lack thereof, but again, anything's worth whatever it is that you are willing to pay. Whatever somebody's willing to pay for is what that is worth, right? So a lot of people can't wrap their head around paying this kind of money for a guitar like this. Like a 59 heavy aged reissue R9 is literally going for, what I've seen, anywhere between, on the used market, $7,500 all the way up to about $11,000. Now, at the end of the day, is it just wood, electronics, and strings? That's all it is. If you want to get just straight to the point and hear that, you're 100% correct. Is it worth $11,000? It's really whatever you're willing to pay. Me, personally, even if I had the $11,000 to part with, I think I would have a hard time spending that kind of money on that guitar, even though this was half the price of that. Again, being a 58, you know, if I was maybe more financially able to, would I be able to justify if I had the 11 grand to just throw out there? Sure. Yeah, I'd buy it. I'd buy an R9. You know, same thing goes if I had the money for an actual 59. If I had $500,000, $1 million to just go wipe my butt with, essentially, would I spend that kind of money? Sure, you live once, right? You know, every day we're one day closer to death. We're not going to get philosophical, but that is fact. So, you know, when you guys are out there thinking about dropping this kind of money, like, obviously don't get yourself in a financial bind, because guitars are expensive and they're becoming more expensive, which is another reason why I happened to buy what I bought when I did, because I knew that the prices were probably just going to end up becoming more. But I guess that's going to lead me into my next point. Is it worth getting these as investments? Personally, I don't think you should. You shouldn't go into buying this thinking that it's going to be an investment. Historically speaking, over time, do Gibsons, Fenders, these guitars have been around for hundreds of years, do they typically hold their value more so over time? Yes. So from that standpoint, if you're thinking about dropping that kind of money on any guitar, especially a Gibson or a Fender, are you more likely to get the majority of your money, if not half, back? That I feel very comfortable with saying 100%. But again, it also depends on the year, the color, the desirability. You know, that's all the factors as far as what's going to make that guitar worth more. But another thing you have to keep in mind, especially with these 58s, 59s, 60s, around the baby boomer era. So like a lot of people that are holding these guitars in really high regard are unfortunately passing away now. They're a lot older, so are these guitars still going to be desirable in that wanted around another 20 years from now? I don't know. I honestly don't know. I don't think the market's just going to completely fall out from underneath them. It's just hard to say at the end of the day. Do I think that this reissue is going to go be a $500,000 guitar? I'd say a very, very slim chance, because it's an R8, meaning a reissue. It's not an original. But again, maybe since this was built in 2022, maybe that was a very special year for Gibson, in the next 10 to 15 years, and this is very desirable because it's, Tom Murphy. Maybe, God forbid Tom passes away, and now it's highly sought after because it came from Murphy Lab. Is Murphy Lab going to be around the next 5-10 years? Does it go away? I don't know, but again, these are all the factors if you're looking at it from a investment standpoint. I would say don't spend the money on any guitar unless you're willing to play it. This guitar spends the majority of its time, not going to lie to you, in a case because, it was very expensive and I just don't want anything to necessarily happen to it. But I do get it out and I do play it, and I don't mind getting a scratch or a ping on it because, I want it to look that way. And like I said, I bought this used, so it was the ultra light aged. I've seen other ultra light aged Gibsons, especially the Les Pauls and this and that, and I believe now you can get any guitar Murphy lapped as long as it's a Gibson. But I see ultra light aged and they don't look anything like this. I think this is relatively kind of medium aged, to be honest. But like these nicks and pings up in here, I don't see that wear on any of the other Murphy Labs, or these little dings here. But again, it's what makes it unique. Maybe the owner beforehand, had really been gigging with it, playing it, had a lot of bracelets, whatever, and just playing and just getting a lot of nicks and pings and scratches. But I really dug the vibe of it. And again, that brings me to another point, is I think, when you have these relic guitars or a Les Paul versus a Fender or a PRS or a Eddie Van Halen guitar or Zakk Wylde or Steve Lukather or Joe Satriani, Ibanez, any brand, it's going to inspire you to play a certain way. So, at the end of the day, my advice to you guys is if you have the money and it's something you want, it's going to make you happier, just do it, man. It's the only controversial thing in life is when you cheat yourself out of getting the fruits from life. Life is short. You're not guaranteed tomorrow. I'm not trying to be philosophical, but again, guys, to put things in perspective, you could be dead 2 seconds from now, and anything can happen. So it's like, learn to live a little. It doesn't mean you got to go buying yourself a Murphy Lab, but if you can get yourself a standard, or if you can't afford a standard, get an Epiphone Les Paul. They got a 59 reissue in Epiphone now. And again, it's just about whatever you're able to afford and what inspires you. There are killer songs getting made today on Walmart guitars in little home studios. You know what I mean? Like, guitars nowadays are made in such high quality that it's very hard to find a guitar that plays like a piece of crap. These guitars are just becoming more and more expensive. And, if you can get it used, save yourself some money, go ahead. So now we had talked about people that had really influenced us to get a Les Paul. Why is this Les Paul so special to me? Well, because again, I never thought I was gonna be able to afford to get one. And I'm just, like I said, I'm very honored that I have one. I have a story about another Gibson, which I'll talk about in another episode, that is very, very special to me, which is why I have a very special place in my heart specifically for Gibson. But another person that really influenced me, specifically on the Les Paul realm, was a connection that I made in 2020. Now, in 2020, obviously that was the pandemic. It was some dark ages, dark times. And I was going through some stuff, like we all were, but it was just the timing, everything. The pandemic was just kind of like just icing on the cake for that. I was working at a restaurant at the time. It was a Lazy Dog restaurant and bar out here at Town Square in Las Vegas. And I was up helping the host stand, and I just remember just kind of like everything, pandemic wise, you were outside, you had, the rules for, social distancing, all that crap, and you had to wear masks. And I remember I saw kind of this frail figure walking up to me, with the beard kind of out of his bandana, and then he had kind of like this little toboggan, and it almost looked like braided. And literally, I knew exactly who that was. Once they got closer, I was like, oh my God. I'm like, that's Billy Gibbons. And he was coming in with another gentleman, and he approaches the host stand. He goes, yeah, we just like to get a table for two. And I don't get starstruck. I mean, I used to work over on, Hollywood Boulevard, and from being in the restaurant industry, I've waited on some people that were, high-end celebrities or knew somebody who thought they were someone, whatever. And after a while, you just start to realize they're just people like me and you. They live, breathe, eat, sleep, all that, just like me and you. They're just people. And I didn't get starstruck, but I talked to him like I knew him. And I was just like, hey, what's going on, Gibbs? Called him Gibbs. What an idiot. So I call him Gibbs, and I was just like, let me grab you a table, man, blah, 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 yada, 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 yada. And I get him to the table. He immediately asked for, some hot water. And I was a manager, okay? I was not waiting on him. And he immediately asked, he's like, hey, man, can I get some, some hot water and some lemon? I got a show later and trying to, get my voice warm. And I was like, not a problem. Gibbs, I got you. Again, Gibbs, come on.
I'm an idiot!
So bring him his hot water, his lemons, so he can squeeze and make his own little lemon juice concoction for his throat. And I let the server come take care of him and this and that. And I don't really try to approach people. I'm not one of those people. I really try not to. But, as the manager, I had to go over there and make sure everything was all right, because he's got a lot of influence and pull. So he didn't necessarily get any special treatment, but I want to make sure everything was going all right. So I came over and I was like, hey, Gibbs, how is everything? This and that. And he's like, man, it's wonderful. The food is fantastic. And the gentleman that was with him was actually, I think, his agent. And we sat there and we talked for no joke over an hour and didn't talk about anything regarding guitar. Not anything at all regarding guitar. We talked about the story behind his toboggan. We talked about cars. He's a big car enthusiast. So we just joked, we laughed, and he was literally slapping his knee. He thought I was so funny. We really seemed to make a connection, to be honest, because, like I said, I was going through a lot at that time. It just made the world to me that, I got to meet one of my guitar idols. And so towards the end of the meal, I asked Mr. Gibbons, I asked him, I said, hey man, I said, do you mind if I grab a photo with you? I know you're trying to get out of here. I'm not trying to be that guy, but it'd mean a lot to me if you could. And he said, yeah, sure thing. So we took a couple photos together. We take our photo, and he goes, all right, well, I want to go ahead and cash out and pay for the meal. And I told him, I said, well, does anybody in your band want anything? And he was just like, oh no, he's like, they've already ate. He said, why? I said, well, I went ahead and took care of everything. I took care of all the food, and I just didn't know if you wanted it for your bandmates or your staff or whoever else you got, your roadies. And he was like, really? I was like, yeah. He goes, no. He's like, no, thank you for that. He's like, you don't have to do that. And I was like, well, I wanted to, because again, you've done more for me than you could possibly imagine without even knowing that you have. I said, you're one of the many, great guitarists that inspired me to even pick up a guitar in the first place, and to take any time out of your day to even just talk to me. I was like, I said, it just really says a lot about you as a person, and I really appreciate that. Thank you. Before he left, he wanted to exchange emails because we were talking cars, and he's like, hey, I'm about to feature one of my Fords on Jay Leno, because Jay Leno's a big car enthusiast. And he was like, yeah, let's, he goes, I want you to, be able to see the episode. He goes, so I'll shoot you a link, once it airs. And I was like, oh, cool. And so later that night, I go home and I shoot him an email. And I just was just like, hey, again, thank you for taking the time to just chat and this and that. You're a stand-up person. I really appreciate that. I really admire your character. Thank you. It was probably about a month later. I go to work and my boss tells me, hey, you got some mail. I put it in your cubby. And so I look, and it's this white envelope right over here. It's a white envelope. and it has a CD in it, and it's signed Billy Gibbons, says For Kyle 2020, and it was his solo release album. It was the Big Bad Blues album, and he signed it in gold, as you saw. I tell you, man, that I was on cloud freaking 9. You know, the impact that had on me at that time just really drugged me out of my rut. And then, I mean, I was just sailing high from that point on. I mean, I was able to, you know, get out of restaurant industries. I got out of debt. I got my dream dog. I went and rented a house when I was living in an apartment for years. I got my dream car. Like, it just really set precipice for me to just get myself out of the funk that I was in, regroup, and just go hit on life.
And we're the 3 best friends that anybody could have. We're the 3 best friends that anyone could have.
You know, hard, and get out of what I knew I could, and what I deserved, and what I wanted. And, you know, I was coming up from a heartbreak situation. You know, there was just so much going on. My dad, you know, had cancer. He's fine. But again, I'm not trying to give you guys too much into my life story, but it just, the impact of that moment was just, it was astronomical. I was like, I cannot believe that at least we had such a good interaction that he even cared to take time out of his day to send me something. And I got it framed over here, and that's why it's in the centerpiece of all these photos, because that, like I said, the impact of that moment was huge, which leads me, you know, obviously to, you know, that's Les Paul, because Billy had, you know, a 59 that he nicknamed the Pearly Gates, which is one of the more famous Les Pauls in existence. Like I said, it's just, the Gibson Les Paul just represented a lot, and I just knew that Billy liked, you know, Les Pauls, and like I said, from the influence of Joe Perry to Slash to Jimmy Page to just, I mean, all these people that had played a Les Paul at some point in time. I just thought I had to have one. It was one of those guitars I wanted to wait on. I wanted to not just go into a store and play a bunch of Les Pauls and be like, ooh, this is the one, or pick it out. You know, some things just happen for a reason, and I just happen to have the money. This one just said, buy me, you know, and I'm sure there's other Les Pauls out there that play better or sound better to them, this or that. I think this one sounds great, but the Gibson brand's always going to have its own aura and desirability. And so, you know, therefore, if I ever had to get rid of the thing, which I hope I don't have to, but if I did, I know at least I would get some money out of it, you know, come push or shove. Probably took a loss, you know, but again, time will tell. When you get into, you know, collecting, if that's your thing, or your guitars or this or that, you know, trying to think about it as an investment. Just get it if you want it, play it, let it, you know, influence you, inspire you to make the best music that you can, and, you know, just that little enjoyment or that peace, you know, from this thing called life. I mean, that's really what it's all about. And so therefore, it's hard to put a price tag on this, you know, on your happiness and your sanity. If it brings you any form of joy, then it's worth it. It's not about, oh, is a guitar really worth $5,000 or $6,000 or $10,000 or $11,000? You know, you are paying for the name, you are paying for the labor that they put into it. You know, the parts, just with inflation and COVID and everything having to come from all these different outsources and places, like, you know, those factors are huge. And again, like I said, this guitar, even back in that day, was very expensive for its time. You know, Gibson, Fender, PRS, all these companies, they take a lot of pride in what they put out. And, you know, I think guitar now, general as a whole, is just, it's super competitive, and that's good for consumers because, you know, we get to benefit from that. It's not like it's just back then, or it's just one or two brands and that's what you had. Now you have all these different options, and with technology and this and that, you know, you don't have to go spending this kind of money to make great music. You really don't. So, you know, I hope that kind of sheds some light on, you know, is a guitar worth it? Is it not? You know, and just to kind of see, you know, a different person's point of view. But again, I do want to hear your all's point of view down in the comments. What's your take? What do you think? Is this guitar worth it to you? Is it not? Why? Do you own one? Have you owned one? Specifically, maybe a Murphy Lab. Do you know a 58, 59? Have you played a real one? in the comments, let me know. I'm interested to hear your all story, or if you have a certain instrument, specifically Gibson, Les Paul, or this or that, that's spoken to you, or an interaction with somebody, please let me know down in the comments. I'm very interested in hearing your all stories and reading, you know, kind of your testimonies, if you will, on your experiences with guitars, or, you know, maybe a guitar god. So now let's get into, you know, the playability of this guitar. Obviously, guitar does play great. Like I said, you know, the neck, it's even despite the urethane finish on it. Slippery as my hands have gotten, it doesn't really stick, which is nice. The D shape is a very nice shape. Kind of makes me almost want a 57 gold top now, considering they are identical to the 58. I think it's just under, just barely under 9 pounds when I weighed it. Again, as far as the aesthetics, you know, I think it's a beautiful looking guitar. Yeah, it's just, it's got the whole vibe. The action is still stock action that came from the store. It plays great, stays in tune. I mean, the pickups, you know, they're very creamy. The guitar does have sustain. Does it have the most sustain I've ever heard in my life? No, but it does have sustain, especially given the fact that it is mahogany with maple top. It's obviously a great sounding guitar, as you've heard. Guitar is very comfortable to play. I always thought Les Pauls were very comfortable. It sits well in your lap. If you are able to afford this guitar, I think, you know, it's worth it in its own right. But again, if you can't afford it, it's not the end of the world. You can get something else too that's equally as great. But I definitely give the guitar a big thumbs up on approval. Also wanted to bring up specifically with the Murphy Lab, people have always said that this guitar has a certain smell to it. And I'm not lying to you, it really does have its own smell. It has to be from the nitrocellulose. I can't necessarily describe the smell. If I was to give something, not similar in smell, but like it's a very specific smell, it'd be like the new car smell. How you get into a new car and it just smells like new car, but you go smell anything else and it smells nothing like a new car. That's kind of like how this is with the Murphy Lab aged guitars. Like they do have a certain smell to it. Now, if I leave this guitar out for a long time, it kind of starts to dissipate a little bit with the smell. But when I get it fresh out of that case, it just hits you in the face. And it's an awesome smell. It's weird, but it does have its own smell. It does. One of the last points I just kind of want to end this on is, again, you do have different options. You have Epiphone You know, if you're wanting a Les Paul style guitar, there are other copies of Les Paul style. You know, if you want to get in a different price point range, you know, there's all kinds of different brands out there that are knockoffs of this that, you know, play great, sound different, or maybe different playability, different vibe. My best advice to you is just get out there, you know, see what's available. Maybe look at a standard, look at a classic, look at a Gibson Studio. You know, you have all of these different price points available to you, so don't think you got to go spending this kind of money necessarily. But if you do got it, you know, it is a cool thing to have, especially for a reproduction, because I could never be able to afford to get a 1958 or a 59 or a 60, an actual one, you know. So again, that's where this kind of concept comes in, is you're actually able to now kind of get something as close as you can, you know, at a higher price point. It's still a custom shop level, so it's going to have different QC, different specs, different standards, which I think are very, very high for Gibson. You can tell that they put a lot of time, love, and energy into their builds. Per usual, guys, I can't thank you enough for watching or taking time out of your day to support the channel. Please subscribe if you haven't. Again, 90% of you all haven't even subscribed. I've really been enjoying the edits. I've been enjoying interacting with you guys. Like, it's been all positive, and I want to do more of it. You know, like I said, I appreciate your support. I can't thank each one of you enough. You know, till next time, do whatever it is you do. Kyle out.